I wanted to title this Origins, but I could not. I cannot. It would be false to say that. Yes, I cannot say the origins of the Israelites. I cannot say that. So I decided to use the early Israelites. Where did they come from? How did they come about? Possibly, where did the name also come from? We know the story the Bible tells, but let's see if we can follow the history, we can follow archaeology, we can follow archaeobotany, when it deals with plants and stuff, animals. See whether we can establish something. What does the evidence tell us? Last week, I mentioned that there was a great collapse. I think during the Q&A, we look at the rise of the empires, the old world. And we notice that in the 12th century, this is my clicker. In the 12th century, the late Bronze Age, that world collapsed. After the collapse, what came next is the rise of ancient Israel. The world of the empires, when we talk about the world of the empires, we're looking from 1250 BCE. When we get to 1100 BCE, there was nothing left of this world. The old world was gone. The strong Egyptian empire, Hatti is the Hittite empire. The Hittite empire, the Mycenaean palaces in Cyprus, Alasia, you can look on the map, you see these places, which was a major source of goods, especially copper for ancient Egypt and other states in the ancient Near East. Gone. The city-states in Canaan, Ugarit in the north. I mean, by 1100 BCE, nothing is left of this world. No Egypt Empire, as we know it, as we knew it. No Hittites. No city-states in Canaan. No Ugarit. Alasia, that the major source of copper for the ancient Near East, was not that important anymore. The late Bronze Age imperial system collapsed. This great imperial late Bronze Age collapsed. What do we see next? We see a situation of reorganization, which at the end of leads to the rise of a new order of territorial kingdoms. That is what we see. After the collapse, there are some rearranging, and at the end of these rearranging, it leads to the rise of a new order of territorial kingdoms. And these territorial kingdoms will be independent of great empires ruling over them for a while. When we talk about a collapse, usually somebody will think that a collapse like an atomic bomb, it just wipes everything off instantly. No, that's not what we're looking at here. We are looking at a process of a collapse, but not an instant destruction. It starts from the late 13th century and took about a century, or continued for at least a century, until the whole thing collapsed. That is what we're looking at. It's a gradual collapse. Yes, Egypt did things to hold off. They were successful for a bit, but it was too much. How does this thing happen? How do these great empires just zilch, just gone? What would be some of the reasons? How come the empires of the past disappear completely? The old scholarship raised the possibilities of earthquakes and storms. Logically, that would do it. But there has been a change of paradigm in research. And we've come to find out it had to do with climate change. When you look in the field of archaeobotany, pollen research specifically, the scientists were able to use pollen research to tell what may have, or actually what did happen. Pollen translates into information about climate. I'm not a scientist, so I brought a couple of videos to explain how pollen can be used to do this. Let's watch these two videos and see what they tell us.
Pollen is practically indestructible, and it's everywhere in everything. But it's also tiny, and unless you have seasonal allergies, you probably barely notice it. But 100 years ago, Leonard von Post realized that these tiny plant particles have a huge story to tell. The compound that makes up pollen's tough shell, called sporopollenin, is practically indestructible. It's so stable that pollen from 310 million years ago could be analyzed for its chemical similarity to pollen today. And ancient pollen provides some of the earliest evidence for land plants, preserving an evolutionary record of plant life. Studying preserved pollen can tell us what kind of plants grew in a place. That, in turn, tells us what the climate must have been like and how it has changed over time. Through radiocarbon dating, pollen can tell us how old a site is. Pollen preserved in the dung of predators can tell us what they ate and what their prey was. As molecular techniques improve, ancient DNA and biological molecules from pollen will provide a wealth of new information, enough to keep pollen scientists busy for another 100 years.
Awesome. What we just watched, well, should I play it again? Oh, you got the gist of it before I give my comment. Okay.
Run it back again. It's only a minute and 26. Run it again.
Okay. Let me run it again. 1 second.
Pollen is practically indestructible, and it's everywhere in everything. But it's also tiny, and unless you have seasonal allergies, you probably barely notice it. But 100 years ago, Leonard von Post realized that these tiny plant particles have a huge story to tell. The compound that makes up pollen's tough shell, called sporopollen, is practically indestructible. It's so stable that pollen from 310 million years ago could be analyzed for its chemical similarities to pollen today. And ancient pollen provides some of the earliest evidence for land plants, preserving an evolutionary record of plant life. Studying preserved pollen can tell us what kind of plants grew in a place. That, in turn, tells us what the climate must have been like and how it has changed over time. Through radiocarbon dating, pollen can tell us how old a site is. Pollen preserved in the dung of predators can tell us what they ate and what their prey was. As molecular techniques improve, ancient DNA and biological molecules from pollen will provide a wealth of new information, enough to keep pollen scientists busy for another 100 years.
Awesome. So, what we just saw is that by analyzing pollen from well-dated sediment cores, scientists can obtain records of changes in vegetations going back hundreds of thousands and even millions of years. So not only can pollen records tell us about the past climate, they can also tell us how we are impacting our climate. So this is how you can take pollen to get data from it. Okay. I have another video. Let's take time to watch this one as well, and then I would make my point.
Maybe you remember the first time you saw a dinosaur fossil on display in a natural history museum. Or even just a picture of fossils in books or online. It's easy to get lost imagining what the world looked like when those stone bones, claws, and teeth were still a part of living creatures. But when scientists really want to take themselves back in time, they don't just rely on fossils. There are a lot of slightly less glamorous samples, from ancient grains of pollen to bubbles of air trapped in ice, that can help us piece together older ecosystems. Studying them has even spawned its own field of science, called paleoecology. And paleoecologists aren't just learning about the past, they're trying to predict the future. Researchers find traces of extinct ecosystems in a lot of places, including locked in the layers of sediment at the bottom of lakes. New blankets of sediment are laid down constantly as nearby rocks and minerals break into tiny pieces. So the muck gets older the deeper you go, and scientists can use these layers to piece together how things have changed over time. For example, thanks to pollen and cores of sediment that were collected from a lake in Indiana, we know that beech trees became way less abundant in the Great Lakes region of the US starting about 8,000 years ago. Beech trees burn pretty easily. But in the part of the sediment cores from that time, the patterns of pollen, charcoal, and minerals hint that drought may have killed off these trees rather than fire. Solving these cold cases doesn't just tell us about the past, though. We can use the stuff in sediment cores to figure out how climate shifts might be related to changes in whole ecosystems. And that can give us some important clues on how today's anthropogenic, or human-caused, climate change might affect our world in the centuries to come. Charcoal...
Was that also clear? I hope so.
Yeah, it seems like they're going through, it was a climate change and pollen is introduced and they don't know how to deal with pollen.
Okay, awesome. Nice. So, what we can do and what has been done to determine what happened to these great civilizations that just vanished. What they did was they went to lakes, because as we've watched the videos and we've seen and heard, pollen sinks into the bottom of the lake and sits there very quietly with currents not disturbing the sediments. So you drill into the sediment at the bottom of the lake and you take samples, or what they call, you take the core. These sediments or stratified layers of pollen tell a very important story and can tell us what took place millions of years back. Now, all we need to know is to date the core and then identify and count pollen in the core. If you do this, you'll be able to determine which year you are in and what actually took place. Well, this was done in Syria, it was done in Cyprus, and in Israel, that is the Sea of Galilee, and then the western shore of the Dead Sea. Backed up by radiocarbon dating, the reason of this collapse 3,200 years ago of a thriving civilization and its collapse was unlocked. What was the result? What did the scientists find out? The results showed a sharp decrease in the late Bronze Age of Mediterranean trees like oaks, pines, and carobs, and a similar decline in the local cultivation of olive trees, which the experts interpreted as the consequence of repeated periods of drought. The droughts were likely exacerbated by cold spells, causing famine and the movement of marauders from north to south. This is Dr. Daphne. She's an archaeobotanist. She was part of the team that did this research. The date that they came up with was the late Bronze Age, 1250 to 1100 BCE, exactly the period of the collapse of the city-states in Canaan and the empires around it. The pollen tells us the story, what took place, what happened. We see the most radical climate crisis in the late Bronze Age and Iron Ages, 1250 to 1100. Like I said, exactly the period of the collapse of these great empires and the city-states in Canaan. But how can something that happened, let's say, in the north, Europe, in Greece, affect people in Egypt? Since we know that climate change impacts different regions, how come it was able to collapse from Greece to Mesopotamia?
Because people become displaced during famines and they have to leave different areas, and that might overpopulate another area, straining their resources. So like all of the neighboring people would pretty much be affected. Like the Egyptians would have been affected when the sons went down to Egypt. Where
Okay.
Jesus was.
Yeah. I mean, we understand this clearly with what just happened with this coronavirus thing. Something, let's say, originates from China. I'm not saying originated from China. Um, but let's say it originated from China and it was able to pretty much collapse our systems as we know it. It's the same thing here. The reason why I was able to bring the collapse of the old world is because the entire world was such an integrated system. I mean, from Anatolia in the north to Egypt in the south, from Greece in the west to Mesopotamia in the east. They were all connected by diplomatic relations and trade. So Egypt had this globalization thing going on. So this is what is happening. This climate change, this drought, cold spells in the south, and in the north, and the people are coming south. We do have textual materials as evidence to what science actually shows. What are they? We have information about crisis of famine and drought in these regions: the Euphrates, Amaah, Ugarit, all from the north. They all speak about big problems with droughts that bring about famine, and they cry for help from Egypt. This is a clay tablet found in Ugarit, and it's a letter from the Hittite king to his counterpart in Ugarit. Let's read. Between 1200 and about 1185 BC, Utanus' correspondence took on a more ominous tone. Polite requests for help turned into increasingly desperate pleas as severe drought and famine began to upend life in the kingdoms and city-states around Ugarit. The tablets speak of biru, that's hunger, in the Akkadian language, which was widely spoken in the Levant, spreading across the landscape. This is what it says. If there is any goodness in your heart, then send even the remainders of the grain staples I requested, and thus save me. Pleads a Hittite official. Food shortages were becoming dire. We have this. In the land of Ugarit, there is a severe hunger. May my Lord save it, and may the king give grain to save my life, and to save the citizens of the land of Ugarit. This is from the Ugarit king, Amarabi. And he's writing to the Egyptian pharaoh Seti II. So not only does the signs show us that this is what is happening through pollen, we do have text that testifies to this thing happening. Yes, with the Shansi, Hammurabi is the same one. It's just spelled with an A and H. No, he wasn't writing to Joseph, Mr. Mark. He wasn't writing to Zephaniah. No, he was writing to Seti II. Mr. Mark is bad.
Was Ugarit a vassal of Egypt at that time, or were they just reaching out to somebody who they knew had resources?
No, reaching out to somebody who had resources, because Egypt did not depend on whatever they depended on. They had the Nile. So Egypt, that's why everybody went to Egypt when there was famine, because Egypt did not depend on what they depended on. No. So now, if there is famine, if there's drought in the north, what do you think the people in the north would do? What do people do?
Relocate to the south
They relocate to the
or
south.
wherever there's
Yep.
wherever there's resources. Move.
Correct. And we have evidence of that. War was also coming. One letter, likely one of the archives, last and probably never sent, speaks of invaders appearing off the coast and establishing a beachhead barely 5 miles from Ugarit. In the letter, Hammurabi begs the viceroy of the Hittite vassal city-state, "Send me forces and chariots, and may my lord save me from the forces of this enemy." The enemy was almost certainly the so-called sea people. So they were having cold spells up there, and they were leaving and coming down south. So the enemy was almost certainly the so-called sea people, maritime Morenders, that is raiders, whose identity remains unclear and who overran Ugarit and burnt it to the ground. It did not fall alone. At the same time, across the eastern Mediterranean, cities and trading networks were threatened by drought, invasion, mass migration, and possibly local insurrections, that is the Epirus. Egypt's dynastic system survived a cataclysmic battle with the sea people. But Messenian and Polis in Greece and states in Cyprus, Canaan, and Turkey were all obliterated in what scholars have termed the late Bronze Age collapse. So this is what has happened. And then we go to Egypt, and then Egypt gives us more receipts because we have a relief from the mortuary temple of Ramses III, where we see a battle with the sea people.